Hi, I'm Jacqueline.
And I'm Courtney, and this is Caffeinated Crimes.
Welcome to part 2. We know you guys like a good two-parter. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you hate it, but I don't think you guys really want like a 3-hour episode, right? I mean, I don't really want to record a 3-hour episode, so I don't know.
I wouldn't mind recording it. I don't want to edit it.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, that,
I was going to say, I did read that the preferred podcast length for people is 45 minutes.
Oh, interesting.
Because when people commute or you're working out, you usually don't commute, most people don't usually commute for 3 hours or work out for 3 hours. So that's the good comfort zone. But you get 2 parts, and if you're a Patreon, you get a bonus. So I mean, I just, perks all around.
Exactly. I mean, I'm with you. And I agree with the 45 minutes, for the podcast that I listen to. I listen to some that are a little bit longer, but I think that 45 minutes is, a good sweet spot because you can usually listen to that while doing something, like you said, versus having to, stop and then come back or whatever.
Yeah. The only thing I hate is when people do 2 or 3 parters and each part is 25 to 30 minutes. And then I'm like, why did we do this? Why did we do this?
Yeah, and usually with those two, they have a recap at the beginning kind of thing, and it's just okay, we could have cut out.
And they have ads.
Yes.
So then it's okay, we could have made this 2 parts or maybe a long one-parter, but hey, who am I to judge?
Exactly. And as we're here rambling on about nonsense and you guys are just get to the damn story, I don't know, whatever. We do have one update from this week. So 14-year-old Stephanie Isaacson was murdered in 1989, and just recently her case was solved with the smallest amount of DNA ever used. It was the equivalent of 15 human cells. So her killer, Darren Roy Marchand, apparently died by suicide in 1995, but I'm sure her family would really appreciate having that closure and at least knowing who the killer was, that he's not still out there to harm someone else. So that's just super cool and, a really good hope for the future that something was able to be solved with such a small amount of DNA, because we know sometimes you get such little evidence that it seems like it wouldn't even be worth it.
Yeah, definitely. And so many of these old cases, it's well, there's not enough DNA to test. There's not enough DNA to test. But if this is only 15 human cells, that's barely anything. So it's, hopefully DNA will take us far, far, far. And a lot of these cold cases can be solved.
Yeah, definitely.
But we're going to keep it short and sweet. That's the only update we have. Kind of a happy update, I guess. I mean, I'm sorry for Stephanie and her family, but at least they can get some, a little bit of closure knowing he's not out still just running around and stuff like that. But we're going to go ahead and get into it. So we're using all the same resources as we did last week. If you want to know what they are, go back there. And if you haven't listened to part 1 for some reason, kind of weird, you're going to be kind of confused, I would definitely go back there. We basically, here's your little recap like we talked about with two-parters do. We talked about Raynella, and we talked about the death of her first husband, Ed Dossett, and how that was kind of suspicious. And then we talked about her second husband dying, David Leath, and that was kind of suspicious. So Cindy, David's daughter, went ahead and sued Raynella and was like, I'm going to get everything because you killed him. And Raynella was like, no, Cindy, you killed him. And then Raynella was charged with murder. So that's where we were. You're all caught up. Let's get into it.
And don't forget that she also tried to murder the husband of the woman that her husband was having an affair with. Right?
Yes, her husband's mistress. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Steve Walker. She tried to kill him. So just a lot. Her son died. A lot going on. So yeah, just go ahead. Don't forget you can listen to that if you want. You should before this, but yeah.
Probably should. Especially in this case. There's a lot happening. You'll be really confused.
And a lot more is going to happen, so. The prosecution team was out of Cleveland, Tennessee, and they were trying it in Knoxville because the Attorney General in Knox County could not take the case. Again, we talked about in last episode, all these attorneys knew Ed Dossett because Ed Dossett, was the attorney general. Everyone knew everybody. And the current attorney general actually got his job because of Ed's death. So they were like, conflict of interest here because you kind of benefited from this. Not that you had anything to do with it, but it'll make you a little biased. So they brought someone in from out of town. Cleveland's about an hour south of Knoxville, so brought them in. And the trial did begin in May 2009. The prosecution opens up their statements and they just go straight for Raynella. They're like, she is a cold-hearted woman who is sick of her husband. She planned his murder. She planned her alibi. And the defense did try to counter it by saying, David committed suicide, which was kind of possibly what it looked like. And they said, no, Raynella is a loving mother. She's a loving grandmother. She's one of the nicest people you'll ever meet. She was a caring nurse. She's a grieving widow. And they just couldn't believe that she's being accused of murdering her husband. And they also say that Raynella is being framed by her stepdaughter, who just wants the farm that the defense claims is worth $18 million.
Wow. And
there is some debate there if that's really what it's worth, but this is what the defense is going to say to the jury. So in court, Jim Bell, who's Raynella's attorney, had the bed that David died in present in court and presented it to the jury. So it's just in the courtroom.
That's uncomfortable.
Yeah, kind of awkward. And apparently before this, he'd had the bed shipped to California so the bed could be examined by one of his experts. I don't know why you wouldn't just file your expert. Think it'd be way easier. That's what he did.
Yeah, I would definitely think so.
But then he brought it into the courtroom. That's where it's at. He even brought in the nightstands and basically recreated the bedroom in the court, which is pretty unusual. Apparently, like, bringing in some things isn't crazy, but like recreating the bedroom is unusual, and judges usually don't like props or theatrics. They don't want it to be like a TV show. They're like, no, we're not going to do that here. But it had been allowed.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, that's some Law and Order shit right there.
Yeah. Which I'm sure most judges hate Law and Order, and they're like, no, we ain't gonna fucking do this.
They're like, that's not how the real world works. I'm gonna stop
part 2
now.
of Jacqueline having issues talking.
Oh, goodness.
So the judge did allow it because the key issue is suicide or murder, how these bullets went in, how they were, what order they were fired, blood spatter, residue. It's all very important. So he did end up allowing it. And he was really reluctant, but Jim Bell did convince him, saying the jury needed this to understand it and not just pictures, which I could kind of see that. Like, you can fully get the picture. But then Jim Bell also brought in a dummy.
I don't like that.
Yeah. Apparently bringing this type of dummy into court is common in murder cases to present. So I guess you could be like, oh, this is how they pushed or how they did. But with the whole bedroom setup, I'm not liking it. So jurors were also shown pictures and videos of the crime scene, and they talk about Raynella's 911 call, which we did play in part 1, and Raynella's reactions when the cops showed up, how the whole scene looked staged, and they really, really focused on the 3 gunshots, because this is like the most important thing, I think, in this case, is these 3 gunshots. Again, multiple shot suicides are not uncommon. It's possible you hold the gun too high on your head, you're not holding it tightly enough, the recoil can make your hand miss. Like, it can happen. It could be hesitation, it could be flinching. But 3, we're getting a little less common here. So the prosecution brings in a gun expert to discuss the 3 shots. So there was a shot to the headboard of the bed, a shot into David's forehead, and a shot to the mattress. So again, the order is very crucial in this case. And in this type of gun, it does not release its shells. They're kept in the gun. So they could open up the gun and see the order of shots. And the cylinder rotates clockwise after each shot. So basically what this means is you'd be able to see exactly the order. And in this case, there were actually 2 types of ammunition in the weapon. So some were Remington and some were Winchester. So in order, the shots went Remington, Remington, then Winchester. So either the first shot hit the headboard or the first shot hit him, it seems like, which doesn't really help.
Yeah. I was like, oh, so that tells us nothing.
Yeah, basically, especially because of the way it went and the way the shots were, it's kind of like it doesn't necessarily prove which one went where. So the gun expert said it could be fired by involuntary movement after death, and it wasn't impossible because sometimes I guess your body can like have like jerking or something. But the medical examiner, Dr. Malusnik Polchan, says there's no way this is possible. And she said there'd be no jerking or twitching, that it was flaccid paralysis. So the way his brainstem was severed, there's just no possible way there was jerking afterwards. And I didn't look too much into this of like how exact that is, but she is a medical examiner, so I feel like I'm going to try and trust her opinion.
Yeah, probably.
So the prosecution is claiming the last shot went into the mattress, and it's clear that David didn't fire the gun. So that is what the prosecution's whole case is on. There was also a mixture of drugs in David's system, and it was a weird mixture. It was very similar to what someone would be given, like, pre-op at a hospital. Kind of weird. And the prosecution saying David was drugged, so he wouldn't have been able to fire the gun or even sit up in bed. That he was so drugged, he wouldn't be able to move. So, of course, the defense challenges this, and James Bell brought in his own expert, and he downplayed the effects of these drugs. He said it would be like having a few beers, maybe slow to react, but not unable to function.
Makes sense.
So, like everything in this case, you have like both sides that are like, no, it can go either way. So the state is using this because there's just no evidence that David fought back. So they're trying to say it was murder, and they're using this drugs in his system to say, well, this is why he didn't fight back. You know, you can surprise someone with one shot, but then you're going to start fighting back if that first shot isn't the one that killed him. And again, they're saying he was very heavily drugged, but if he was so drugged and unconscious, why are 3 shots required at all?
That's a good point.
So, you know, if this person cannot move, how can you miss?
Maybe she was just a really, really poor shot.
We have seen what a poor shot Raynella is, but This is a lot closer. So I'm like, how are you messing this one up, honey?
Maybe she didn't have her glasses on, you know? I don't know.
Oh. And David did not have a prescription for these drugs, so the state is trying to remind the jury that Raynella was head of nursing and that she would have access to them. But she was also retired at the time of David's death. So even if you are a current nurse, you can't just like walk in and like grab drugs. It's not really a thing.
And especially if you're retired and you're not currently working there, it would be a lot more difficult.
Yeah, like I know my mom, I know it was at least for like the like medical marijuana pills they had, I'm sure it was probably that way for like painkillers, is like there was like 15 different things she had to do, like enter this code, enter this code, enter this code, and it would like pop up like who grabbed it for what, like there would be like a trace of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, but the state's trying to say like that's how she got these drugs. She knew people at the hospital. They knew her and they just gave her these drugs, which I think is not a great argument. So prosecutors are also saying that David was too vain to shoot himself in the face. So again, in the first one, we talked about the plastic surgery and how he worked out. They were saying, oh, he's a pretty boy. He paid all this money. He was concerned about his looks. He dressed nicely and worked out. So they're saying he wouldn't shoot himself in the face, which I could see either way, I guess. I don't know.
I feel like if you're at the point where you're choosing to kill yourself, I don't think that would necessarily be a thought. And it could even be something of like, oh, I've struggled with self-esteem my whole life, and that's what made me do these things, and therefore I want to take out whatever that thing is, you know? I don't know.
Yeah, and again, he was missing that eye. And he did shoot himself over his blind eye, so don't really know. And a lot of people also said he was scared of guns, and multiple witnesses were called to testify to this. But again, it's a thing where I think if you've come to that decision that you want to end your life, your fear of guns doesn't really matter, especially if that is a solid way to complete what you're going for.
And honestly, I feel like that would be more of an argument that he was the one that did it, because that could explain the 3 shots. If he was so scared of guns, maybe he did flinch more. Maybe he wasn't expecting the recoil because he's not familiar with them. I feel like that would support that theory even more, honestly.
Yeah, I agree. And they also brought up how he did not want to be cremated. So we talked about this again, part 1. So he viewed this as against his religion. There is a sect of Christianity that believes the body needs to be whole when Jesus comes back, so they don't agree with cremation. I know if you bring it up to my grandmother, she will not be happy. So there is certain religious beliefs that are very against cremation. And Cindy believes that David did not know Raynella had previously purchased the cremation. So that one again is kind of weird because, I mean, it was a long time ago she purchased that cremation.
Yeah.
So prosecution also attacks David's dementia and saying it was made up. So in the autopsy, they said they examined the brain and found no signs of early Alzheimer's. And the defense says they can't find that in an autopsy. And the defense is saying they didn't see signs of Alzheimer's because they didn't look for dementia, which can be different, which I guess is true. Like, you can have dementia but not necessarily have Alzheimer's. So,
yeah.
Again, we just have, like, experts on both ends saying things, and you're like, I don't know which one's true.
And there could also be other conditions that mimic the signs of dementia that don't necessarily show up in a brain scan the same way that dementia itself would.
Yeah. And David had been seeing a neurologist who believed he had early signs of dementia. And the lawyer who met David about the will said that David was acting very weird the day he showed up. He seemed kind of duller, and he started crying, which was very unusual for David. Like, David did not cry frequently, so it was like kind of weird. And a loss of control of emotions is a sign of dementia. And if you, depending on how you view the "my wife is trying to kill me" to the nurse comment, that could be some paranoia. So he had also been showing up to doctor's appointments acting weird as well. So they documented that too. But the prosecution saying this was Raynella drugging him, which I guess could be possible. But again, a lot of loopholes here. And they're also saying this can explain the emotions and how he was having trouble getting out of bed in the mornings. Was that it's Raynella drugging him. He doesn't have dementia at all.
And Cindy, his daughter, also says that she was around him frequently and she never saw any changes, any signs of mood changes or depression. However, Cindy didn't know that he had been treated for dementia or that her grandmother had cancer. So kind of seems like David didn't really share everything with her. And also, if he did have this medical diagnosis, I mean, we all know sometimes parents keep things from their kids to protect them. So it could be that he didn't want to worry her, so he didn't tell her about it. So again, that could kind of go either way as well.
And as well, too, you know, if you're getting told you have dementia and you don't want to accept it, like, you might not tell people because you're like, no, like, that's a lie. It's not true. I'm not, no.
So ultimately, the jurors need to know what the motive is. So why would Raynella kill David? So they're saying that she was just sick of being married and that she would benefit from the will. So kind of a financial motive, but this isn't really a perfect motive either because most of their land was already in her name. So the most expensive property they had was already Raynella's. So again, the financial motive doesn't make a ton of sense because she's not getting much more than she already has being married to him. And Raynella also has an alibi, like we mentioned before. And according to the defense, she has a great alibi because she is seen multiple places from 9:15 that morning to 11:30 when she finds him. The time of death was not able to be detailed enough to really help pinpoint, you know, when exactly he was killed and where she was at that time. So Dr. Maluznik-Polchan puts it at some point between 8 when her daughter leaves and 11:30. So that's a very broad window, especially because we know she wasn't seen until around 9:15. So that gives her over an hour that she could have been the one to kill David before she is seen.
And I feel like she only really said, like, between 8 when the daughter leaves because the daughter was there. Like, they don't even really know. And I'm like, but do we have testimony that the daughter actually saw David if he's still in bed?
That's true. Yeah.
So, kind of a little not solid here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because if she didn't see him before she left for school that morning, then it could have been much earlier. So the prosecution is basically saying that, like we said, it must have happened in the morning, and they think that her alibi is too structured and too staged. They said that it was like she had made a point to be seen. She was doing odd things that she didn't normally do, like picking flowers, visiting Mamie, like we talked about. But again, Mamie had just been diagnosed with cancer again, so that would explain an unusual trip that day. But they think that it's just too perfect, that she has an explanation for where she was every minute of the day. So Mamie's house is also where the gun used was found, so they're focusing on that being a huge factor as well. So there were only a few people who had access to this gun. So Mamie, who was in the hospital at the time, Raynella, David, and possibly Cindy. So now the prosecution and the defense start their closing arguments. So the prosecution is really focusing on the forensics, especially because there's no witness that puts Raynella at the house that morning. So they focus on the shots, specifically the third shot, and the severed brainstem. And the defense focuses on how this could be a suicide, and there's plenty of reasonable doubt that it's not murder. Again, 3 shots aren't uncommon. In a suicide, Raynella has no motive, David was sick, like all kinds of reasons that they're like, there's enough reasonable doubt. They're saying, look, this was a suicide because he was sick, because whatever reason, even though it would be an odd one. But if you don't believe that, then it's because Cindy did it. So
yeah, they're like, you don't believe us it was suicide? Okay, then Cindy killed her.
Yeah, this is our backup plan if you don't believe the first one. So after deliberation, the jury was deadlocked. It was 11-1, which I feel like happens often. One person held out and just could not agree on a guilty verdict, which I feel like if I was ever on a jury, I would be that one person because I'm like, no, there's always reasonable doubt. I can't commit. I don't know. So if anyone who does jury selection listens to this podcast, I guess I'm never getting called for jury duty. So it was declared a mistrial because of this one holdout. So then in January of 2010, they began Raynella's second trial. So the facts were all the same. You know, most of what they said in the first trial was presented here as well. However, they did have some new evidence come forward. So the prosecution found a letter that Raynella had written years before. And they're saying that this letter shows Raynella's true colors. So in November of 1999, David had hired a title firm to research the value of the property that he and Raynella owned. He did not tell Raynella about this, and the title firm sent the bill to the barber shop where he worked, so basically it's clear he was trying to keep this from her. So about a month later, she found out about this, and her response was to confront the lawyers and write an angry letter to them. So the prosecution is saying that this shows that their marriage was falling apart well before David's death, and his letter was proof that Raynella had been planning to get rid of him for a while.
But I also want to say that just because you write an angry letter about your husband doesn't mean you killed him, especially as years before. I can't count the amount of text messages I have from Jacqueline and Tiffany that say, I'm about to kill my husband. But I know they're not actually about to kill their husbands. But just because you're like, I'm pissed because you did this behind my back, doesn't necessarily mean that all this time you're stewing and 2 years later you're going to kill him.
Exactly. So the judge did refuse to have that letter presented to the jury, so he just feels like it would be too prejudicial. Again, it was written 4 years before his death. A lot's happened between them. There's nothing that directly links this letter to David's death, which, again, like we said, like this has nothing to do with what's happening then. You know, it's not like it mentions anything that would have to do with his death or anything. It's just her bitching about her husband. Again, we've all been there.
Yeah.
So the prosecution and the defense both tried to fix any possible errors from the first trial. So during the second trial, her lawyer, James Bell, basically drops a lot of the expert witnesses that he'd brought in before. So he doesn't bring the bed back. He doesn't try to argue the blood spatter as much. He basically drops the suicide challenge and just is like looking at the prosecution. They're like, you say that she killed him? Okay, well, prove it. There's no evidence that she did. We don't have to prove anything. He's like, I'm not going to sit here and bring up all of these possible doubts because it's not on me. It's on you to prove that she did do it, which ideally is how our justice system works. But he didn't even call the key alibi witness, which was Raynella's daughter. So he later said that Katie was having medical issues, and so he didn't want to put her through that. Her older daughter, Maggie, did testify about their loving relationship, and Bell said he didn't think that he needed to call Katie as a witness, but she was a key witness in Raynella's alibi, so it's kind of weird that he didn't call her because, again, this is another person who can confirm what time she ended up somewhere. Mm-hmm. So after 2 days of deliberation on January 25th, 2010, the jury does find Raynella guilty. The judge immediately sentenced her to life in prison, and she was sent to the Tennessee Prison for Women. Now, normally, this is where our episode would end, right? But we're only 20-ish, 5-ish minutes into a two-parter, so y'all know it's not over. It's not that easy with Raynella. So, a few weeks after she was sentenced to life in prison, a former deputy and former cop crossed paths at the courthouse. So, Steve Robinson was a sheriff's deputy, and so he was talking to Shane Cooper, who was Jim Bell's investigator because they used to be friends. And Shane mentioned his work on Raynella's case. And Steve's like, oh yeah, I remember that. I was there that morning. But this is a red flag because he's not on any of the scene logs. Like, they have no evidence that he was there that morning. So basically, from the moment law enforcement arrives on the scene of a death, they're supposed to have a crime scene log that lists everyone who's there, what times, where everyone is, everything. It's supposed to detail every single thing, every single person who was there so they can know who's had access to this crime scene. Now, they can see that there were a lot of people at the crime scene and a lot of people who were not logged on here. Police did do their best to maintain the scene, but like we mentioned before, a ton of people showed up, especially knowing who Raynella was and what her history was. Mm-hmm. And this isn't the only revelation that Steve has while talking to Shane. He said that a deputy walked out of the house waving the gun over his head and said, I found it. I found the weapon. Here it is. I'm sorry, you did what with the murder weapon?
Policing 101, you don't touch the murder weapon at the scene of a death.
No.
So even if you think it's suicide, don't touch it. Don't touch it.
Nope, not your job. So then the deputy goes back inside and puts the gun back down. Okay, so the position of this gun has a lot to do with whether it was a murder or a suicide. And if the gun was moved, now they can't determine which it was. Like, they can't use that in any of their evidence. And part of the state's claim for murder was that the gun was positioned next to David's body, but like the butt was backwards. So it's not laying like you would think it would if it was in his hand when it fired. Like, it looks like it was placed there deliberately. So if Shane's story is true, it wasn't placed by Raynella. So this is really bad for the prosecution because they're like, we just lost this huge piece of key evidence.
Yeah, and I feel like especially in like murder versus suicide, if there's like 9 shots, like in the Lanny case, like clearly it's not suicide, but in these where it's like, well, it could be either. Gun placement is a lot because, you can't really, after you shoot yourself, perfectly place down a gun. Mm-hmm. So now if they're like, oh, remember how like we just told the jury that it was Raynella staging it? Well, actually, we fucked up.
Mm-hmm. It was us unintentionally staging it.
Yeah.
So now, obviously, there are chain of custody issues as well. So this is just so vital to the case. And like Courtney mentioned with the way that the bullets were in this gun, if the gun had been messed with, the cylinder could be out of line, which could mess with the state's argument about when each of the shots were fired. So the tampering could mean that the order could have been manipulated. However, you would have to open the gun for this to happen, but it's not impossible. You'd probably have to take the shells out and then put them in yourself to be in a specific order, but because now the chain of custody has clearly been messed with, really anything is possible. So like anything that's like, oh, this could possibly happen, now it's all out there as a possibility.
Yeah, and like with the defense, it's like reasonable doubt. So if you're like, well, someone touched this gun, so this could happen. Well, that's reasonable doubt. You don't have to prove it happened.
Exactly.
You just have to prove it was like a possibility.
Yep.
So Shane does get Steve to sign an affidavit saying he did not see the gun on the bed and saw a deputy with the gun. So the prosecution has no idea this is going on, and they don't know this until Bell files a motion to grant Raynella a new trial. Prosecutors obviously challenge it and accuse him of knowingly filing a false affidavit, which could cost him his law license. So Bell fires back and says that the prosecutions went and made Steve change his story, because now Steve, I guess, is like, oh crap, I'm in a whole bunch of poo-poo. I didn't say that. What are you talking about?
He's like, I was just trying to have some courthouse gossip. I didn't think this was going to go here.
So they had gotten on the phone and said after he had time to think about it, they took his statement on a recorded call, and he says he just misremembered. It was a mistake. And now that he'd taken back his statement, it's basically meaningless, which is kind of suspicious since he is a deputy. Who knows what they were like, you have to change your story. Mm-hmm. You got to change this.
You can't be telling people that, sir.
Yeah. So 2 months after Raynella is convicted, a federal judge unseals an investigation of James Bell that had been going on in secret through Raynella's second trial. So Bell is accused of making up a meeting with a client in order to get out of a case in federal court. So he gave a detailed account, but then they found out it didn't happen. So he went and was like, oh yeah, this happened, and it didn't. So he fucked up, basically.
Whoops.
So Bell did have to pay a fine and go through some ethics training. So why is this important? Well, it could show that Bell was distracted by his own personal issues and didn't give Raynella a proper defense. Because, like we said in the second trial, he didn't bring the bed back. He didn't even try to argue suicide. He was just like, okay, whatever you say, objection. Okay, objection. Mm-hmm. So
didn't seem like a lot of effort put into the second one.
Yeah. So, and if he knew he was in hot water, he didn't want to be combative also or argue with any of the prosecutors or officers with authority, because he's like, I don't want them to get mad at me over this trial, and then my case, something bad happens, so I'll just play nice. So this could be like proof that he was not adequately representing Raynella. So around the time they're investigating David's death, authorities start to wonder about Ed Dossett's death. So we've talked a lot since then, but remember, Ed's death had been ruled accidental, he'd only had a partial autopsy, and the life insurance had a double indemnity paying a large amount of money for an accidental death. So just a little recap, because we've put so much into your ears since then.
I think I needed that recap as well, so thank you.
So the medical examiner had sent off a blood sample, but the lab was very backed up, so they continued without it. Well, apparently we get these back, and Ed's blood levels showed very high levels of morphine, like a lethal amount of morphine. So Dr. Maluznik-Polchan is saying there is no way Ed could have gotten down to the corral or stood up or possibly even kept breathing with the amount of morphine in his system. So in hospice patients, you can't expect them to have a higher level of morphine because you're going to have a higher level of tolerance because you're usually taking it because you are in pain and all that. But you should never see it this high. Even with a high tolerance, never this high.
And again, he wasn't found dead in his bed where he's on that much morphine just not moving. He had supposedly walked all the way down to where his animals are.
Yeah. So Dr. Maluznik-Polchan also says there's absolutely nothing in the report she saw that supported the idea that he was trampled by cattle. So it's like, okay, Dr. Pedigo signed off on that, but this is not making sense. So at this point, Raynella also gets charged with first-degree murder of Ed Dossett. And this is kind of a weird timeline thing, so this is kind of around the time that they're investigating David's death. So we're kind of going a little back and forth here. I know it gets a little confusing because there is so much going on.
I think that tends to happen when you have a lot of suspicious dead husbands.
Yeah, and you marry your next husband 6 months later, and then he died. Yeah,
things happen very rapidly.
A lot. So with this, they did have the means, access to his medication. She had access to morphine. She had motive. She had the double pay versus the single pay on the life insurance. But was there enough for a trial? Arguably, a lot of people say it should have gone to trial first. It was more straightforward. It was 15 years old and the evidence wasn't fully complete. But, it seems like there's more things there that could possibly get a conviction. Mm-hmm. But they also couldn't necessarily figure out where Ed did die. Like, was it in the house and then moved? Was it down by the pasture? So Raynella couldn't have moved his body on her own. And again, there was that rumor that David helped her with his body. But it's all kind of speculation, so it's not really like that would stand up heavily in court. But what really made them feel this case wouldn't hold up is the lack of a full autopsy and the fact that Ed was on a morphine pump. So these pumps administer the drug in measured amounts. And there's really no evidence to say Raynella gave him this lethal dose of morphine, so just because he had it doesn't mean she gave it to him. Mm-hmm. And it could be argued that he went down to the pasture and did fall, and then a cow stepped on the pump, making it malfunction, and shot a large dose of morphine. So that could happen, if it wasn't like a stampede, but, a cow just stepped on it, it shoots it in, and that could explain it. But they didn't have this pump anymore, so they couldn't see, is this pump damaged? Is it working? Whatever.
That seems outlandish, but also, 100% possible.
Yeah. I mean, stranger things have happened, let's be honest.
I mean, just think about the 1,000 Ways to Die show. There's plenty of things that could happen.
There really is. Which is something, I know this is off topic, I'm sorry, but something I think about often. We have really steep stairs, and I'm like, what if I fall down these stairs and people just don't believe that Kevin didn't kill me? Or when you turn your head really fast and you get that sharp pain, I'm like, what if I somehow just sever my brain cord and nobody believes Kevin didn't do it? I think about this too often, guys. I don't want, unless Kevin does kill me, I don't want him to be wrongfully convicted in my unfortunate death.
Don't worry. If you die and Kevin is arrested for your murder, I will be Julie Ray Harper's husband, and I will go to law school and defend Kevin, and it'll all be okay.
Yes, please. But tell me that you consume too much true crime without telling me right. You consume too much true crime. Okay. So at this point, prosecution now wants to exhume Ed Dossett to try and get a second autopsy, get a full autopsy. But Raynella and her lawyer fought back on this. Ed's two daughters also hired their own lawyer to fight this. They don't want that either. Mm-hmm. So proving there's enough evidence to dig up a body in Tennessee is very hard. It is the last of last resorts. And prosecution had to prove that there was no other way they could get this information. And their best witness, who was Dr. Maluznik Polchan, testified against them almost because she could not swear to the judge that 15 years later there'd be enough left of Ed to test for morphine residue. So she's like, You're right, I can't sit here and lie to you and say it would benefit it. I can't do it.
And that makes sense. If you're going to dig up someone's loved one, you need to be sure that it is going to be fruitful, something's going to come of it,
And especially when his wife and daughters are we don't want this. Yeah. When you have family pushback, you're gonna have to have. Yeah. So that was enough for the judge to deny the request to exhume the body. The prosecutors didn't give up though, and they asked 3 times to exhume the body with more evidence on why they need it. Each time the judge said no. And so again, this is around the same time as Raynella's trials for David. So once she was found guilty, they just dropped the case. They're like, okay, she's already in prison. It's not worth it. Already serving a life sentence. It's not necessary. So up until this point, we haven't really referred to the judge in Raynella's case. And it's not because we don't know his name. Mm-hmm. This was very purposeful on my part to not include his name until this point. Because the judge who ruled over all of Raynella's cases was Richard Bumgarner. So
that might sound familiar to you.
We did talk about this last week. Everyone from Knoxville knows his name. You know his name now. You know how much we hate him. had a very big scandal. He'd been found like using drugs while holding court. He'd had, all of the misconduct with defendants in his court. We did talk about that in the Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom case that we covered 2 weeks ago. Go listen to that if you haven't yet. Again, very hated man in Knoxville. Mm-hmm. So when he sentenced Raynella to life in prison, he was high during that. So he was actively very high on drugs during this point. And he was high on drugs that he broke the law to get. So he had fumbled around with the verdict and reading the jury statement. So he was kind of almost obviously high. But everyone just kind of thought he was exhausted because he was handling this and the Christian Newsom case at the same time. But he had begged to be on the Christian Newsom case. Like, he had fought to be on that case. So, to even add more fuckery to that.
Which, I mean, and all Bumgardner fuckery aside, it seems odd to me that a judge would so strongly advocate to be on a certain case, because that tells me that you have a reason, like, you want to rule a certain way. And as a judge, you should not go into a case with those feelings. Obviously, with the Christian Newsom case, I think everyone who hears about it has the same feelings, but we're not judges who are going into that case. And to, like, obviously you're going to have your own bias either way, but to so strongly fight to be on a case that you have strong feelings about just seems really sketchy.
And in that case, they made a judge recuse himself because they thought he was too attached to the case.
Yeah.
And he didn't even, he was just like, not even doing anything as crazy as begging to be on the trial. So,
yeah.
Very odd. So TBI had started a secret probe on the judge while Bumgarner was holding hearings on Raynella's case. So this was the time Bell was pushing the statement about the gun possibly being mishandled by the police, and he had denied her a retrial during this time. So this is all happening while they're secretly probing him. He's high on drugs. So he then took a medical leave of absence, which he never came back from, and the Supreme Court declined to take the case as well.
So then in 2012, Bumgarner was convicted in federal court of lying to cover up a defendant's drug crimes. He did spend 6 months in a work camp. And while all of this is happening, Bell is working on another appeal for Raynella. For some reason, he never mentions Bumgarner's drug usage, which I feel like is a really important thing to bring up in this appeal. And the appeal is denied. And it's also learned that at the time Bell was representing Raynella, he was also representing Bumgarner's drug dealer.
So a lot going on here.
Yeah, so Raynella did not know this. That seems to be kind of a conflict of interest there. So at this time, the family fired Bell and hired a new attorney, Joshua Hedrick. However, the odds are not really in Raynella's favor now. Courts don't even have to hear the post-conviction reliefs, and Raynella's new attorney is trying to, get together to get her a new trial, but it's not looking great. But Hedrick and his team filed a new petition quoting Bumgarner's drug use. So he was high during the whole second trial and couldn't adequately give her a fair trial. Like we said, his drug use was clearly impairing his ability to work at this time. But ultimately, all of his decisions were legally correct. So he wasn't necessarily doing anything incorrectly, but it was clear that he was using drugs at the time he was working. But this made it really difficult for appeals because they couldn't cite like a specific error that Bumgarner had made. So it's like, oh, just because he was on drugs, therefore he was impartial, we need a new trial. But they couldn't say like, oh, he specifically did this or whatever.
Yeah, they weren't like, oh, well, this shouldn't have been made. This decision was wrong. Like, I guess he was still mostly doing his job well somehow, but...
So Judge Paul Summers is now taking over to hear Raynella's appeals. So the Supreme Court said no new trials, but Judge Summers could still grant her a new trial because Bumgarner did not give her a fair trial. So Summers did rule that Bumgarner was too high to serve no matter how solid his rulings were. And he did order a third trial for Raynella and set her free from prison to wait for this trial. So prosecutors are like furious. They're like, we've convicted this person. You just let her out. They said the whole trial was on TV. Like, no one saw anything wrong. Like, how can you claim that he was that impaired? and they think that it was just outrageous that she would be granted a new trial because of this. The Attorney General decided not to challenge Summers' ruling, and a new set of prosecutors came in for the third trial. So Judge Summers did come to the prosecution to let them know that he knew Raynella and Ed Dossett. So he and Ed had gone to law school together and were actually prosecutors together. And he had seen Raynella many times at various functions. He had even gone to Ed's funeral, and he asked the prosecutors if they thought he would be too biased to hear the case. But the prosecutors decided they wouldn't challenge Summers being on the case. He also told them the trial would happen in Knox County and would not be moved. They chose not to challenge this and agreed to have the case in Knox County. So a lot of people rightly think that Summers should have been asked to recuse himself on the case. Like, you knew the person on trial and the person that she is being accused of murdering. Like,
yeah,
you should not be the judge on that case.
And, like, my thing is, too, like, I see this a lot. Like, I just joined this Facebook group, and, like, girls are always posting dresses, and they're like, is this too white to wear to a wedding? And people are always like, if you have to ask, the answer is yes. So that's just what I'm thinking here. Like, Judge Summers, if you have to ask if you're too biased, you're too biased.
Exactly. Yep. So the courtroom for this trial was packed. There were journalists everywhere, people from Dateline, other shows like that, just trying to get some kind of footage. Judges, lawyers, everyone wants to be here for this. And there were many people who knew Raynella, Ed, and David who came here. And again, Ed was Attorney General at one point, so was very familiar with this group of people, so it makes sense that they would all be there. Mm-hmm. So in this trial, Hedrick decided to recreate the bedroom where David was shot in the courtroom. So the prosecutor's opening statements talked about how David was murdered, that the third shot went into the mattress, so only the killer could have done that, not David. And the defense, again, claimed that David killed himself. So this trial is looking like it's going to be a lot like the first one. Raynella does not testify in this trial, and the defense did file a motion for acquittal. So this is pretty common to file. Again, with my expert Law and Order knowledge, they present the information, and then the defense is like, I move for acquittal. There's not enough reason to blah, blah, blah. But this is rarely ever granted in real life.
But apparently that's exactly how it is from the podcast I listened to, because Josh Hedrick was like, everyone always files it, but usually, like, walking up, they're like, turn around. Like, you don't even get there, but, like, they're like, every single case, like, you're always doing it no matter what, because why not?
Yeah, just kind of your last-ditch effort there. So this would kind of mean that the judge is serving as the 13th juror, which we discussed a couple of episodes ago. So the judge can decide whether or not there's enough evidence presented for the jury to even go into deliberations. So, again, 99% of the time, they just automatically dismiss it, but Judge Summers did say that he's going to take it under advisement and think about it. So, the defense and the prosecution then give their closing statements, and Summers excuses the jury. So then they come back, and Summers starts to give a ruling on the acquittal motion, which is kind of unusual. He goes over the evidence. He says that the state did provide enough evidence that a jury could call it a homicide, but then he said when it comes to her involvement, it's a different answer. So he's saying, like, yes, you proved that this could have been a homicide, but you did not prove that this was Raynella. He says there's nothing that connects her to the weapon or to the scene. There's just no hard evidence that she was there. He says that he doesn't think it's possible that Raynella could have killed David and then went and did everything she did that morning to establish her alibi in the specific small period of time that she had. He's like, I don't think this is realistic. So Judge Summers grants the motion for acquittal and finds her not guilty. So she's free to leave.
Yeah.
So Raynella cries out in court, and her daughters run to hug her, and we are going to play that clip here.
The defendant, Raynella Leath, is not guilty.
So after this, the former prosecutors in this case thought that this was really odd. He excused the jury, so it seemed like they were going to start deliberating, but then he comes back and grants the motion. So, again, unusual. And the jurors later said that they were ready to convict. So they're like, if we had been allowed to deliberate, we would have found her guilty. And they were rightly upset that they didn't get a chance to give their rulings and opinions.
Especially because you're like, you have to take time off work, you have to sit through all this stuff. You're sitting there and then you're like, oh, what?
Like, I was here
this
for
was for
no
nothing?
reason. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the ruling is also not allowed to be appealed by the prosecution. So as we know, in the United States, we have double jeopardy, which does not allow you to be tried for the same crime twice. So this case is done. So Raynella is forever not guilty in the eyes of the law.
I bet you didn't see this one coming. I bet you $10 you didn't see this one coming.
However, many people are not convinced that she's innocent. A lot of the experts who testified thought that the jury should have been able to decide. And like we said, they did think that she was guilty. Like, the jury would have convicted her.
I also find it weird that they can't appeal it.
Yeah.
Like, that feels like something you should be able to appeal, especially because I think you would have won your appeal because, I mean, Judge Summers is biased. Like,
that's the thing. Like, it's literally
it's
one
just
single
weird.
person who is making this decision, and then it's like, whoop, nobody else can challenge it. Like, I'm sorry, are you God?
Which I guess that actually, I'm having a recovered memory here, happened in the Move case that we covered with the officers.
Yes.
And the judge just stopped it in the middle and said, nope, I can't believe you're doing this. Not guilty. So it's crazy. That's crazy. I feel like maybe you should have like, okay, I'll grant it, but another judge has to grant it. I know that gets so complicated because then you have to have multiple judges and it get blah, 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 blah. But something, some kind of like second thing, you know, for jurors to find them guilty, you have to have all 12. But now one judge can be like, okay, not guilty, sign. Like,
that's the thing. Like, there is way too much power being given to one single individual. And obviously the prosecution thinks that she's guilty. Cindy was very upset with this ruling. Steve Walker, who, remember, was the first man that Raynella tried to kill, maybe the second one, we don't know.
Yeah.
And he was just completely shocked by this. And a lot of people are like, there's something fishy going on here. Like, Judge Summers knew Raynella, knew Ed, was kind of close to this family, so they're like, maybe he was paid off. So, did Raynella kill Ed Dossett and David Leath? I don't know. You tell me. Probably.
Yeah.
I don't know. There are doubts, though, because with David, Raynella didn't really have much to gain from David's death. How would she have gotten these drugs that he had in his system that she supposedly got from the hospital because she used to be a nurse, which is a weird argument. Did she have some kind of long-term game where David helped her kill Ed and then she had to get rid of David? But why would she kill Ed if he was about to die anyway? I mean, there's just so many back and forth that's like, who knows?
Jacqueline, what do you think? Do you think she killed
Okay.
both or one?
So here's my thoughts on Ed. So I think Ed was in on his own death. So
I think that too.
Yep. Because
a little bit.
Because he had, and I mean, maybe not, but that's what my mind goes to. Like, he was terminally ill. He knows that if he dies by an accident, his wife is going to get a lot more money. He's like,
help his wife and his kids with his huge farm.
Exactly. Like, I'm going to die anyway. And especially if they see now that there was a lot of morphine in his system, like, that would have been a gentle death. It's not like he said, all right, I'm going to go get trampled. Okay, give me this dose of morphine and then put me out here so it looks like I got trampled. And that would explain why there was the print on his chest, but not, like, damage done to him. Mm-hmm. So. And,
like, his, the person, like, his coworker who became Attorney General after his death was also like, nope, no. I can't say the word. I'm just, you guys know what I'm saying. Short speak here. Sure. No autopsy. So.
Autopsy.
I think. Not autopsy.
Yeah.
But, so he could have possibly been on it and been like, don't do it because we know. Mm-hmm. I think that's very possible.
Yeah. David, I'm more inclined to say that she killed David. The 3 shots.
I am too.
I know it's possible, but it just seems 2. I would probably lean more towards her innocence. 3 is just kind of puts it over the edge for me. Like, again,
and we've seen how bad of a shot she is. How bad she shot at Steve. So we've seen before her trying to kill someone and missing. So I could kind of see it, because she would write in her diary, like, David's so mean today, and, like, what if maybe Ed wasn't on his death and David was? And then she's like, he's got dementia and he's starting to talk.
Yeah.
Speculation corner over here, but.
I mean, that's true.
Yeah,
David could have been in on Ed's death as well. Maybe Raynella and David were together while Ed was sick, before he died. Maybe he wasn't a part of her, like, murdering him. Maybe Ed was still kind of the mastermind behind that. But like you said...
But Ed and David were childhood friends, so maybe he's like, yo, David, I need you to help us.
Yeah.
And then David has dementia, and he's saying Raynella killed her first husband. I don't know.
Yeah. That's Courtney and Jacqueline's speculation corner. That is in no way... we're not saying this is what happened. This is just our discussion of what could have happened, what our thoughts are. Legally, don't come for us. We're not,
Yeah, and if you listen to the podcast or read the book, like, they do talk a lot about the crime scene. Like, in the podcast, like, they have the actual recording of the officer speaking, like, while he's going through the crime scene. And, like, there is some kind of weird stuff, like untouched food and all this. Like, it does seem very, very staged and very odd. So,
yeah.
I could definitely see her being found guilty in the court of law. I mean, basically 3 juries besides one. Basically, what is it? 12 plus 12, 36. 35 of 36 people were probably going to find her guilty. Like,
yeah, like, that's pretty, if her trial had gone the way that trials are supposed to here in the United States, she would have been found guilty. Like, this one judge who's just like, nah, I don't think you did it. I'm just gonna override all this because I'm a judge and have this insane power. What? I don't know.
To quote Kendrick Lamar, I believe it is, no one man should have all that power. So, anyway, you can continue.
Any other thoughts on what happened, who did it, who didn't do it?
No, I definitely think it's kind of what we said. And I think maybe with Ed, I'm kind of go back and forth on whether it was like straight out murder. Seems kind of weird. But I do see possibly, losing Ed, losing her son. She finds out her husband was cheating on her with at least one woman, possibly fathered, all this. And then maybe she did come unhinged. She tried to kill Steve, and then maybe she was like, well, you know what, now I'll kill David. So I could definitely see her just, like, murdering him because she did try to murder someone else before. So
yeah, definitely.
I could definitely see that.
That is a good point that I didn't bring up in my summation of the case here. Because she did, as we all know, attempt to kill someone else. So we know she has it in her. So I'm going with she definitely killed David. No doubts anymore. But Raynella is now back living on her farm, so she gets to see her kids and her grandkids.
Who all think she's innocent.
Yeah.
They all think she's innocent,
So like we mentioned at the beginning of last week's episode, we did read a book by Diane Fanning, which is called Her Deadly Web. And if her name sounds familiar, she is the same author who was in communication with Tommy Lynn Sells back when we talked about Julie Ray Harper. So just a little connection there. But like we said, we
have so many connections.
I know, goodness. There is the book, there is the podcast, like there's a lot more information out there. So definitely, check those out. Please let us know what you guys think. We can't even do an Instagram poll for this one because there's too many possibilities. Like, we can't say
we'll have to make like 7 slides. I'll make the one where you can write your answer because we can't even do a poll. I can maybe do a possible Twitter poll, but I don't know how many. I think I can only do like 4.
I don't know. There's too many possibilities here.
We need a Google Doc. A Google Doc survey that everyone can fill out.
Oh, goodness. All right. So, with all of that being said, Courtney, what is your perk of the week?
Okay, my perk of the week is going to tie in to this episode, kind of, because of who suggested it, who's Kelly. So her girlfriend, Alejandra, is a bartender in the area, and they were so sweet and kind to invite me to a cocktail competition, which a lot of the bartenders from around Knoxville get together, and they have to use, a specific brand of alcohol. Like, this one was a certain brand of this whiskey, I guess, or they could use bourbon. There was 2 options, I think, but it was the brand, and they have to make a cocktail. And so there's judges who judge them, and then you do the popular vote, kind of. So you can vote for which one's your favorite, which is what Alejandra won. She won the popular vote. Hers was really good and she had smoke with it, she was smoking it, and it was very pleasing to the eyes to watch it be done. But they were so sweet to invite me to that, and it was so nice, and I really enjoyed it and had such a fun night out. It's nice to kind of be able to get to do things again. And I mean, free alcohol, who can say no? So I thought that was a perfect tie-in. And also our friend Alyssa, who listened, so shout out, because she's the one how I met Kelly and Alejandra. So just a big shout out to them because they all listen. At least they tell me they do. So if you don't, I'm gonna know. But
I know. If they never bring this up, they didn't listen.
But that is my perk of the week. Jacqueline, what is yours?
First of all, I just want to say a cocktail competition just sounds so cool, and like what a fun idea.
So fun.
Like it's very like Food Networky, like, you know, you have to use these ingredients and make this and, you know, whatever. So that sounds super cool.
I also felt super like Bridesmaids when it was like, Helen knows the owner. Because like I just walked up and I was like, I'm friends with Alejandra. And they were like, okay, here you go. I'm like, thank you.
Like, thank you. I'm just going to go.
I feel so cool
here.
for the first time in my life.
So my perk of the week is very different from a cocktail competition. And if you guys are in any other developed country of the world, this is going to sound like a really sad perk of the week. But in the US, you guys get it. So my perk of the week this week is just my 12 weeks of maternity leave that I've been able to have. Again, it's very, very sad compared to what the rest of the world gets. But here in the United States, where we don't give a shit about families, I'm very grateful that I've been able to take these 12 weeks to be at home with my daughter, to focus solely on her. I do go back to work in a couple of weeks at the time of this recording. At the time you guys are hearing this, I will be back at work. So I just want to reflect on the past 12 weeks that I've been able to not focus about, you know, work and all those other things and just focus on my daughter and bringing her into the world and really getting into a routine and being able to really have, you know, these special moments together.
Yeah, and we talk about how much the US sucks, and Jacqueline was very lucky to get 12 weeks because a lot of women get like only 4 or 6. I know
Yes.
a few people at my work, I think, had to go back after 4, maybe 6. So, hey, US, fix that.
Get your shit together,
but
please.
yeah.
And mine wasn't fully paid, by the way. That's not a thing anywhere in the US. I mean, maybe
Yeah.
a few random places, but it was, most of my 12 weeks has been paid. So that is very nice. You know, it's my own vacation and sick time, but it's fine.
Yeah.
We get enough that I was able to, you know, save it up for this purpose and still also go on a vacation before I got pregnant. So it's not like I had to save years and years to be able to. Anyway, y'all let me know the details.
Yeah, I know a few of my coworkers saved up their time and even had like FMLA time where you could just like take off, like, and your boss didn't have to, like, you couldn't be fired for it or whatever, but had like saved up vacation and sick time to use like after, but like they just couldn't because they were just kind of forced to come back. But yeah, but that's really nice that you get to spend those so important like first few weeks too. Like so much developing happens. I mean, so much more is going to happen too, but like so much happens in those first few weeks. So,
and I really think
that's
just
exciting.
like getting ourselves into some kind of routine, you know, because it's like I can't even imagine like, I mean, obviously it's going to be a whole new routine when I do go back to work. You know, for now at least working from home with her. Obviously, I'm so grateful that I'm still going to be able to have her with me, you know, at this time. But going from not working to working with her, but I feel like we're in a routine now where we can add that in and it's not like going to be so much and so many changes at once. But if you guys want to tell us about your cocktails, about your country's wonderful maternity leave so we can just cry in jealousy, you can do so on Instagram at Caffeinated Crimes Pod, on Twitter at Caff Crimes Pod, that's CAFF Crimes Pod, on Facebook at Caffeinated Crimes Podcast. Again, we've plugged it already, but if you guys want to head on over to patreon.com/caffeinatedcrimes, if you sign up for the $5 a month or greater tier, as of right now, you will have a brand new bonus episode waiting for you. Anytime we do a 2-part Patreon subscribers get parts 1 and 2 the first week, and then they get an extra bonus episode the next week. But we do monthly bonus episodes either way, so even if we don't have a 2-parter, there's always a new episode every month. You can have the full backlog of all the episodes that are out there, all kinds of other goodies. So again, that is patreon.com/caffeinatedcrimes. If you want to support, Jacqueline being able to be on permanent maternity leave. I don't know.
Yeah, if you want to support Courtney quitting her job and becoming a full-time podcaster, because at this moment in her life, it's her goal. So, but yeah, and if you want a pin and a sticker without paying money, you can possibly win that by giving an Apple review. You'll also get a $10 gift card to the coffee shop of your choice with that. Once we draw someone, once we get to 50, so please go do that. It's how we get recognized. Please give 5 stars. 5 is good, 1 is bad. If we're bad, I'm sorry. Just please stop listening and don't leave a review, because that's going to make my feelings hurt, because I'm a sensitive Sally.
You can just quietly go away. You don't have to tell us.
Sorry, I know I keep rambling, but it makes me think I listened to a podcast today with Brene Brown, and she said anytime anyone leaves her like a bad comment about her book or a bad review, she'll go to someone's book who she thought was like absolutely incredible and find a bad review to be like, okay, see, this book was incredible and someone had to say something bad about it too.
I mean, that's a good point. Like, there are bad reviews about even the most wonderful of things. So that is true.
It's like the saying.
That's
like,
a good tip, Brene Brown.
You could be the best, juiciest, most wonderful peach in the world, and there's still going to be people who don't like peaches. So, anyway.
There you have it.
Go and do that. Leave your name or something. Anyone who has an iPhone around you, get them to review. But in the meantime, go have a cup of coffee.
And don't commit a crime.